All right, welcome back to Dr. Schwartz and Mr. Power, where we bring you only the finest in artisanal strength, conditioning, and nutrition information. I'm your host, Mr. Alex Power. As usual, here with me today is my co-host, the connoisseur of concussions, the Brongnignalian of brain trauma, Dr. Alex Schwartz. How you doing,
Doing
Alex?
great. My head doesn't hurt today.
Oh, that's good. That's good. It's a way to start a Wednesday. All right, well, if the lead-in wasn't hint enough, today we're going to talk about concussions and brain trauma in sports. This is something we both have some experience in, you more than I. And so we're going to discuss, what are the potential negative effects of concussions, and just all concussions, not just in sports. Who's getting the most concussions in sports? Also, what about subconcussive impacts? So strikes to the head that don't result in concussions. And finally, what, if anything, can we do about it? So I hope everyone's ready for the hard-hitting episode with an impact factor only matched by my concussive power for puns. Let's do this. All right, so apologies for my jokes aside. Let's get right to it. Alex, how many concussions have you had?
I've had a lot. I don't have a count, and that's not just because I've had a lot of concussions. It's just that I never really kept track until the cumulative effects took their toll on me.
Okay. Well, why don't you then? So you played university football,
I did.
Or collegiate football. Why don't you sort of take us just like a brief overview of your biggest and best, I suppose, the highlights of your concussion. We don't have a reel for it, but maybe take people through, the big things that led to what ended up being a turning point for you.
So I'd actually have to go back to high school and rep football. That's when they started. So I've played football for quite a long time, up until my last last practice of football, which I'll get to. But it was a cumulative effect. So I would take bumps to the head. And when I was playing football, the advice was typically something to the extent of, oh, it's just a bump to the head. You can get up. I had a teammate at the time, too, who was told by a doctor at the time, and this is how much things have changed, that it's just a little bruise on the brain. You'll be fine. You can probably play next week. So I don't know where this doctor got their medical license from. But I remember distinctly one really bad concussion that I had in high school prior to going off into collegiate football. And that was one where I ended up just seeing the color green and no other colors for a little while. And this was my final game of high school. And we had a principal who was watching at the time, not our coaches. Our coaches were great. They're really nice, loving people. But the principal saw me, and I kind of crawled off the field, and he said, what are you doing? And I told him, like, all I can see is green. He goes, well, stop looking at the grass, because everybody's like a tough guy when they're not in equipment. So I went, it turns out he wasn't a great person after all, but that's a whole other story. And so I went into university football, and the thing is, when I played football, I played in a position where you can't really avoid contact and head trauma. So it was a position that there's constant contact.
So in what position?
So I played on the line. So I was a defensive lineman, and then and I'm going to get a lot of upset defensive linemen about this, about saying this, but in university, the coaches realized that I was smarter, so they wanted me on the offensive line, because there was a lot more thinking involved rather than just running in a couple of straight lines and just hitting things. It's a little more strategic on the offensive line. So regardless, what you basically are is you're either hitting, you have to be hitting somebody effectively, and to generalize it, every play, if you're not hitting somebody, you're not making contact with somebody, you may be doing something wrong. Now, again, that's a generalization. But that being said, there's other positions, like receivers or secondary defensive backs, where they may not get hit every play or that often, really. So it was one of these things where there was head trauma that was going to be inevitable. Just as a comparison, I was told, I remember somebody saying that football is not a contact sport, football is a collision sport. And it kind of made sense at the time to me, because I've played rugby as well, and with rugby, because you don't have the sort of protective factor of equipment, you're forced to try and tackle somebody with a little more technique. So you need to grab them and try and wrap around them rather than go head first into them. Whereas in football, that doesn't seem to be the case, where a lot of times you're blocking or something, you make head-to-head contact. So I had what were more concussions, and it's hard to really tally up how many of them there were because looking back on it now, and knowing what we know about concussions, you can kind of think about post-concussive effects, which we'll talk about. But for me, I think the last concussion that I ever took in football um, was the product of I would like to say just bad coaching decisions to some extent, because we were playing against our own team in scrimmaging, and we were told to do something, which is something called a cut block. And there's this unwritten code in football that you don't cut block your own teammates. And what a cut block is you dive right into their knees. And so we did that, much to sort of my hesitation, but we did that because, we were doing a live scrimmage and we had to do this to our own teammates. And I took a knee to the head. And this was during two-a-days, so this was in training camp. And so in the morning I was fine, but then things got worse. And in the afternoon, when we had our second practice, we were just going through run plays and just basic protection patterns. We weren't actually making contact with anybody. And so what ended up happening was I ended up just running out when we were supposed to stand in one place. I ran a run play rather than a pass play, pass protection. And the last thing I remember was my coach grabbing me, yelling me, and going, "What are you doing? If you ever want to keep starting here, you need to be able to know these plays and everything." And he was all blurry to me. I remember I turned around, I walked off the field, I looked at the team doctor, and he's like, "Oh, you're okay. You just, you're probably just a little mild concussion or whatever, just brushing it off." And my friend, she was a trainer with the team, looked at me and she's like, "You need to go to the hospital right now." So she was a bit ahead of the game when it came to concussions. And so from there, that's when things got worse.
Okay, so a bunch of concussions leading up from, I guess, starting in high school, going in through university,
Mm-hmm.
to a concussion that ended up leaving you, confused and basically doing the wrong thing on the field, like just not knowing what's going on,
Mm-hmm.
hours later, right?
Right.
So, and we'll get back to it in a bit, but it doesn't sound like the advice you were generally receiving, either from coaches or, other players, was, to be, I guess, gracious, ill-informed, right?
Yep.
This reminds me. So there was something I saw today that I think lead us into our next section, is the rip from the headlines section. So in preparing for this, I saw an article on the internet, and it was about, I'll just read the headline. At 58, Tom Celo is one of the oldest college football players ever. Here's why he tried out. And I guess, as we go through the rest of this, all I can say is good luck, Tom.
Yeah.
We're hoping for the best, but I would have my reservations. Okay, so you touched on a bit of this. So the potential health effects of concussions, right? And so these are, some of the long-term impacts that have been linked with, traumatic brain injuries, which concussions are classified as a minor traumatic brain injury, which sounds funny, but I get, that's the nomenclature. So concussions and, blows to the head are thrown into this category. So first off, don't panic, right? So before we read this is an alarming sounding list. But most concussions, either self-resolve within weeks to months with no, detectable long-term effects. So here it is. What's been linked with head traumas and concussions specifically? Parkinson's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Alzheimer's, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, motor neuron disease, and there's actually a longer list, but you get the idea, right? We have these measurable long-term impacts. They seem to be moderated by, the severity of the concussion, the frequency. So if you have multiple concussions, the potential outcome or the risk of negative outcomes is higher. And age is another moderating factor. So if you're younger, it seems to be more significant. So yeah, it's a scary list, but again, don't panic. Because it doesn't help, right? There's no point in panicking. And there's a lot of content that makes you want to panic, but we don't want to do that. All right. So, I did a bunch of research on the statistics of concussions in sports, just to give a bit of, background for understanding how frequent concussions are, what sports they tend to occur in the most. And I guess the first thing to open with is that concussions are actually pretty hard to study. And they're also probably underreported. Now, the underreported part is largely an attitude thing. So historically, like you said, coaches would tell you to, walk it off.
Yeah.
I remember a good friend of mine in high school was playing soccer, and he was a goalie, and he jumped on the ball right as someone was going in for a big kick, and they just kicked him right in the side of the head, knocked him out cold, right? And I remember his instruction was to walk it off, because I saw him later that day in class and we were discussing it.
What if you can't walk?
So, yeah, luckily attitudes are changing, but that to say likely underreported. And as to the hard to study part, anyone who knows anything about research will probably guess. And for those who don't, you can't do a clinical trial on this, because you can't deliberately give people concussions. That's never going to be approved, right? You can't take a control group where we say, you guys don't get concussions, and then a second group and say, okay, we're going to kick you in the head with a machine that precisely kicks or something, and we're going to measure the effects long term.
And I just to sort of add to that, with my specific situation, I ended up having to go to the special center in McGill that was studying concussions at the time. And I had, because I had pretty bad symptoms after the first week after that last concussion, I couldn't walk or talk properly for a week, which is kind of scary. Felt like a zombie. Time was just passing by. And for about a month or two, I had vertigo. Every day I was waking up, and just the entire day, everything was spinning. I don't know if you remember some of this, when I was.
I do remember that, actually.
Yeah. And
I remember Michelle and I telling you, okay, you need to stop playing football. But that's, yeah.
Well, it sucked. And so luckily the neurologist that I went to go see, she was a concussion specialist. She worked with a lot of pro athletes, including a famous concussion case in the NHL, Eric Lindros, so she was telling me about these studies that you're talking about. And she said the downside is that the people that they were studying were just taking a sample of athletes from sports that were known to be highly concussive. So I think football, they were likely working with a McGill football team at the time because it was close. And I think the Montreal Alouettes too. I'm not sure, but
hockey's a big one.
Hockey's a big one. Yeah. So she was working with national teams as well. And so they had this testing, and they gave it to me as well, and it was baseline testing. She said it's sort of, kind of missed the point with you because we don't have baseline prior to, but I want to see if maybe if symptoms get worse. So she was still doing these tests, and it was like computer reaction tests. They threw me into an MRI as well, and they did CT scans. So there were a number of things that they were doing that they typically would have done for baseline measures, but in her case, she said it might still be worth monitoring you to see if things get worse. You can come back and then we can look at measurements again if you want to be part of this. But on top of that, she also said, I'm not telling you to not play football anymore, but you should probably not play football. And also here are the potential long-term effects. And it was that list that you gave me, and that scared the crap out of me.
Yeah, no, I remember that actually pretty well. Because, we were all young at the time, and you're younger than I, and you were, I think, had a glimmer of optimism still about, her saying, I can't tell you to not play. And Michelle and I were like, you cannot play. This is a terrible mistake.
It was stupid. Yeah.
All right. So to study or to understand, concussion statistics, we have to understand how they're measured, and that's in exposure hours. Mm-hmm. So this is, a measure of the number of hours you spend doing the event or playing the sports. And so most of the statistics are expressed as, concussions per 1,000 exposure hours. So there'll be a bunch of references on this that I'm just going to throw in the show notes if anyone's interested in going into where we found these statistics and looking into it themselves. Again, they're all open access, which is deliberate. But there's a fair bit of literature on this. So overall, across sports measured by most, people measuring this, you have about 0.17 concussions per thousand exposure hours, which is very low. But that involves, includes things where you would never expect a concussion, and they just occur because people fall or that there's a collision. And then you get into the fun stuff. So American football, the football you played, not to be thrown together with obviously soccer or what, the rest of the world calls
Yeah.
football, and rugby have among the highest incidents. And it varies by age. And that's something you see over and over in these numbers. And so for high school kids, in one of the studies, they found it was 0.43 to 1.03 concussions per thousand exposure hours. So that's 10 times more than, the average you see across sports. And then at the collegiate level, it was a bit lower. It went from 0.05 to 0.8. And then the NFL, it was 4.56, which is a lot higher, right? That's about 40 times higher than, a sporting average. That statistic doesn't include practice, which is interesting because, as you said, your injury actually, or that's not fair. Your last major concussion occurred during practice. So it's safe to assume that there's some incidents that aren't being captured by the
Now,
statistic.
and I would argue that those statistics, if you included practice, would likely get exacerbated with high school and collegiate more than they would with NFL, simply because in practice in high school and college, to some extent in college, you shouldn't, but coaches still do because everyone thinks they're in the Remember the Titans movie. They'll do a lot of hitting drills, particularly in high school because, players are still trying to learn how to tackle properly, or sometimes some coaches just want to do it as punishment because their players didn't tackle well. So there is a lot more contact. So I find it interesting that they exclude practices from those. I suspect that when you get to the professional level, there's a lot less. The number wouldn't change as much simply because they do a lot less contact in practice. Because if you're at that level, you're healing up, you're getting paid, so it's expensive for you to get hurt in practice. It's not a good idea.
Well, they're
They're
valuable.
valuable. So I don't think that would change, but it's interesting because I do think that high school and college would likely increase if you included practice in those.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting idea. I think it's also it's probably hard to track practice too. I mean, that's the other thing. It's just, someone had to actually collect this data, and that's never trivial, right? And so for Australian rules football and club level rugby, you see similar numbers like 1.8 up to 7.97 concussions per thousand exposure hours. So not, I've heard, the refrain, well, they don't use equipment, so they tackle better.
Yeah.
Turns out doesn't make a lot of difference.
Yeah. Fast and colliding.
Part of that might have to do with the biomechanics of how concussions occur, which we'll cover briefly in a second. And then this final statistic I'll give, the penultimate one is one that showed the difference between male and female collegiate hockey players, with males having 0.41 concussions per thousand hours, and for females it was 0.91. So about twice the incidence in females as males, and that's something that you see across the statistics. And it's hard to say for sure. It's been proposed that it has to do with smaller neck musculature in women, because you see something similar in junior athletes as well. But again, hard to say for sure because it's hard to study because you can't just go around giving people concussions. And so finally, and this one's interesting because it really shows the difference between, gameplay and practice. Whereas, in football and stuff, you see, these concussions occurring in practice that aren't necessarily happening are captured in the gameplay statistics. In Taekwondo, the statistics for gameplay are extremely high. So when you're actually matched up against someone, which again makes sense, the goal of the sport is to, I'm simplifying, but it's to kick the other person in the face. So there's going to be a lot of concussions, and there are, but it's quite a bit lower if you throw practice in there too, which again, I suspect a lot of the practice is, conditioning, stretching, just kicking drills and stuff where you're not actually trying to hit a person. Anyway, it's 11.29 concussions per thousand exposure hours. So, and that's during matchups. So if you're doing Taekwondo, or if your kid is, and you're someone who just wants to kick mats or kick, bags and stuff, you're probably going to be
Did you
fine.
see anything with boxing when you looked at this?
Yeah, there was, but I didn't want to turn this into a lot.
Hmm.
Like, it's high in
Yeah.
combat sports. I took Taekwondo because I just thought it was interesting. And there's a surprising amount of research on Taekwondo, I suspect because it's an Olympic sport. Um, but yeah, there's statistics on
Hmm.
MMA, there's statistics on boxing. Um, I just didn't pull them because, it can go on
Yeah.
forever. All right, so I don't know. Any thoughts on that? Like,
None of it's
yeah, I mean, I guess you're
yeah,
saying that.
none of it's
Uh,
super surprising to me. It really one of the things that I do think about was I remember the statistics where and it was likely because of participation numbers, but it was with younger athletes. And because younger athletes don't typically participate, like kids, don't typically participate in things like football until they get to a higher age, or even rugby to some extent, depending where you are in the United States. They start kids really young with football. Soccer was one that was pretty big, and that's usually pretty surprising for people to hear. But part of it is because headers, kids learning headers, so they've actually changed a lot of the ways that they teach youth soccer, and that includes no headers up until they get a little bit older, which is interesting because it's a
yeah, and
technical part
we
of the
actually
sport.
talk about that a little further up.
Mm,
Yeah, because it's I think that's what you said. That's one that really caught people off guard, right?
yeah,
And I think, and that's captured in our little section on the non-concussive or subconcussive impacts. But
subconcussive, yes.
yeah, that's why I didn't throw that in that section. Um, but so I think before we go on, I want to throw in a little bit of biomechanics, and I don't want people to cringe when I say that. We're not actually getting into the mechanics in any detail at all, so don't panic. That's just the word. So that turns out your skull and your brain are pretty resilient to direct impacts. Um, this isn't an endorsement of getting punched in the head, but your skull's pretty thick. It evolved that way for a reason. Keep your brains on the inside, keep them protected. And if you imagine a strike to the head, if you know anything about mechanics, shockwave just sort of travels through the brain, through the rest of your body, into the ground or whatever, and not a lot seems to happen. Where you get into trouble is when there's an acceleration event. And that's why I was referred to in the literature. And so if you imagine, again, something strikes you in the head or doesn't strike your head at all, right? Like if you think of motorsports, or if you think of even in, football, where if you're struck really hard and there's a fast change in direction of your head, your brain rattles around inside. And that's, a simplified explanation, but that's the event that we're trying to avoid. It's not just the impact, because in most sporting situations, the impact isn't typically, forceful enough to cause direct, you're not going to cave in someone's skull tackling them. But you can jerk their head around pretty aggressively. And in particular, it seems that rotational impacts rotational acceleration are particularly damaging, which is interesting. And then again, going into the mechanics of that, well beyond the scope of this, and in fact beyond the scope of my knowledge. So we're just not going to do that. Um, but that's an important thing, I think, to understand going forward, because we come back to it when we talk about prevention. And we come back to it when we talk about, the subconcussive impacts, like in soccer, headbutting or heading the ball. Sorry, not headbutting, but I don't know what sport that
I
is,
mean,
but
there's been incidents
we
of it.
should avoid
Yeah,
it.
don't get headbutt in soccer, but that happens when they go for balls too, when they're both
Yeah.
going for headers. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. So yeah, it's the acceleration of the head. It's the acceleration event that seems to be the source of the majority of damage, when we're talking about head injuries in sports. And so finally, the last thing we'll discuss before sort of getting into the other parts is what you alluded to, and that's the subconcussive impacts. And I remember when the research on this first started coming out, because it was all over the news. And I think because it was pretty surprising, and that's this research coming in 2003 in soccer,
Hmm.
where they found that, the number of heading events, so number of times that a player would head the ball, was correlated with, negative health outcomes. I'm just looking, it was in neuropsychological deficits. So they could tell, or, there was a measurable difference in people who headed the ball more versus less. And so to drive it home, that they weren't measuring concussions, right? Like
Hmm.
they're not correlating concussions with these effects. They're correlating how many times someone heads the ball. So that's pretty interesting, right? That's this subconcussive stuff that you were talking about. And again, like, and maybe you can speak to this because I think you know the rules or what's going on in soccer better than I do. But one of the measures that's been taken to try to deal with that.
Yeah. So one of the measures has been to as part of the rules not having heading. I know that that's the case here in Canada, or at the very least in Ontario. They don't allow heading until they're, I, I believe it's around 13, 14 years of age. Um, and it's interesting because it is a fundamental part of soccer. I know football, you basically, it's flag football if you want to prevent that kind of contact, but with soccer, heading is an important part of the game, because you can kick you just can't touch the ball with your hands and arms, basically. So your head is a useful part, especially when corner kicks come in and players are jumping for it. But it was directly because of the study, there were policy changes with the sport to try and mitigate these kinds of injuries in youth and in kids.
I mean, you touch on something too that I think of, and I don't have any illusions about this happening, but these sports are just made up things with made up rules.
Hmm.
You could just say no heading, right? And
Yeah.
again, I know that's never going to happen, but there's no reason it has to happen at all.
Yeah.
You could just say it's only with your feet now, and you can't touch with your arms, can't touch with your head.
Right.
But
But then you get into the
I digress.
taekwondo
Like I
problem.
said, I have no illusions. Yeah, taekwondo, soccer, that's the
Yeah.
next big
You
thing.
just get kicked in the face all the time.
Okay, so next we're going to get on to the next section, and that's what about prevention? Is there anything we can do? Okay, so you already sort of answered this, but and it was a while ago, to be fair to everyone involved, but did you ever get anything in terms of preventative advice from either coaches or, trainers or people involved in football when you were playing?
When I was playing, no, it was a lot of it was just sort of a part of the game, and it was a risk that was part of the game. Things were changing a little bit at the time. People were acknowledging concussions were a thing, which was at that time a pretty big acknowledgement. But in terms of anything preventative, there wasn't anything particular, and there was no way to prevent any kind of concussion with the position that I was playing, simply because there was always going to be contact. Linebacker was going to come blitz full speed and try and hit our quarterback, and I was expected to jump in front of them and make that block. And eh, some high flying 250-pound guy had to get stopped by me, right? And it ended up with a
Yeah.
head-to-head collision. So it was hard.
So other than, like you said, limiting the types of impact in practice to, lower risk events, there really wasn't a whole lot to be done, it seems. So yeah, there is some research, or there's some work on prevention, and I suspect some of our listeners have probably heard of this. And similar to research on concussions, it's hard to study because you can't take two groups, give one of them or give one of them the preventive
Mhm.
intervention, whether it's equipment or in the example we're going to use, neck exercises, and then try to give them both groups concussions, right? Like, it's just ethics committees just aren't a fan of that. Um, so yeah, there's been a bit of research showing that if you do neck strengthening exercises, you can reduce the incidence of concussions. And this goes back, if you think, to what we were just talking about, the biomechanics, where if you can strengthen your neck, the thinking goes, you can prevent acceleration events, right? So stronger neck means when something hits you in the head, or if something hits your body quickly enough to displace you quickly, you know, it can prevent this, whiplash event or this jostling of the head. Um, and so there is a bunch of research on this. And so in 2024, there was a systematic review and meta-analysis. So This group pulled together all the research they could find that fit their criteria, and they looked at it and said, if we put this all together, how does it look? Does it seem like neck strengthening, reduces an incidence of concussions? And so what they found is kind of mixed. So I guess the first bit is the good news, and that's that if you try to strengthen your neck with neck exercises, your neck does get stronger, right? There's even changes in neck thickness. So if you want a thicker looking neck just for aesthetic reasons, then you can take that away too.
Get that harness.
And so, yeah, pretty consistent result was, yes, the neck gets stronger. And this shouldn't shock anybody who knows anything about, strength training. If you train a muscle to get stronger, it gets stronger. Does it prevent injuries? This is a bit more mixed. So in some of the studies that they looked at, it seemed to result in a lower incidence of concussions, particularly when you're looking at things like soccer and heading the ball. But in other events, particularly combat sports and motorsports, not so much. And then there were a bunch of null findings too. So where they just, anyway, it wasn't unanimous that this helped. And I think if you think and this is me speculating, but when you think of what happens, or actually, I'm going to step back for a second. So even though you have a stronger neck, doesn't mean you're going to be able to react in time to prevent a head acceleration event, right?
Okay.
So your neck's strong, and when they measure it in the lab at the end of these studies, they typically, attach it to some sort of force measuring device, and they push against your head and you resist it, or they attach a harness and they pull it and you resist it, and they can, they measure it and they're like, okay, you can exert this much more force than you could 12 weeks ago. Great, your neck's stronger. Now, if you imagine an actual sporting situation, like you're, going to block some guy in football, or you're about to be punched in the face or kicked in the face by, some MMA opponent, are you able to brace quickly enough to prevent the event? And so in the literature, they talk about head kinematics. So just because you're stronger doesn't mean, you're bracing quickly enough.
Motorsport's an interesting one to me.
Forces are so high, and I don't think that any amount of neck strengthening.
Well,
it's just outside of what we've evolved to deal with.
Obviously. And I think the thing that's really interesting to me is that unlike these sports that you're talking about where you kind of can't see things coming, in motorsport you can, but where are the concussions coming from? Are they coming from the turns where they're taking that kind of G-force, or are they coming from accidents which you just can't really train for or control?
I think it's the collision is what we're talking about. Collisions, or, in the case of collisions.
Yeah.
That's the short. They're not talking about like G forces where you've got the static load.
Yeah, which is what they train for.
and you're
It's really
stuck.
funny. It's not going to help at all with collisions. So it's just interesting to me that
No, the forces, I think you can just set motorsports aside, because the forces you undergo are massive. Like they're so far, orders of magnitude higher than anything we would have heard before inventing vehicles, right? And one of the things that they've implemented in a lot of motorsports, like where possible, head harnesses. So essentially just strapping your head so that it can't move accelerate as much anyway. Although there's no getting around it. It's a mitigative approach. There's no, motorsports are nuts. So I think, again, extrapolating, I think with the neck strengthening, if it's something like soccer, which is one of the few things they found it actually helps, it makes sense. Like you're going to head the ball, and in fact, the act of getting ready to head the ball involves bracing. The balls, even when they're going fast, it's nothing like you see in some other sports, and the frequency is also quite a bit lower, right? Like if you think of heading the ball in soccer, you got a few good heads a game, maybe.
depending on position too.
Whereas, if you're doing MMA, or boxing or taekwondo, like the whole goal is for the other person, is to strike the person in the face as much as you can.
And catch them off guard too.
Hopefully go unconscious, right? And so even if the beginning, if you think of, multiple matches or multiple rounds in a match, maybe you're good, you're able to brace at the beginning, but by the end, anyone who's watched any of these sports, things get sloppy, reaction times are down, your ability to recognize and brace for impact is diminished,
Yeah.
right?
And I mean that
so
changes with heavier weight classes, because then it doesn't even matter, because the first shot is just going to be basically getting hit by a vehicle. So it's not like you're getting tired,
yes.
right?
And I mean, that's it. And your opponent matters too, right? Like, it's
Yeah.
just someone known for like taking people's heads off. Um, I think, or similarly, hockey's another big one, where they didn't really see a lot of benefit to, neck strengthening exercises. And then when you think of the context,
Speed.
on the one hand, even like compared to a combat sport where someone's punching you versus, someone skating at you at 20 kilometers an hour and smashing you into the boards at a weird angle. I mean, the forces are very high, right? It's much more than you would encounter heading a ball in soccer. So, the neck strengthening is good. Do it. Again, the research shows it does strengthen your neck. And if you're able to brace, it does seem to prevent the incidence of, or reduce the incidence of head injuries or brain injuries. But don't expect too much from it, right? Like, don't think that this is going to make you concussion proof. Okay, so what are the takeaways from all this? I think, again, I'd like to reiterate, don't panic, right? So, the group level risks associated with inactivity are higher than the risk of injury in most sports, right? Like, not doing anything is also really bad for your health. So that is not the solution. Like most things, a part of the solution is being informed, right? So know how to identify, or know some of the ways to improve your ability to identify head injuries that may or may not be concussions. Learn about what you can do to prevent them, whether it's, changes in gameplay or changes in exposure. And, let that guide you. So I pulled up like a quick list of, symptoms of someone that might be suffering a concussion. And these are, in the moment sort of things. It's not exhaustive. I encourage everybody to do some research. So, if you or, someone you're coaching is experiencing headaches or nausea, tinnitus, so ringing in the ears, blurry vision, fatigue, or if they look confused, slurred or altered speech, which I have a funny story about, or loss of consciousness. So if if you're observing any of these things after either a head blow or a suspected blow to the head, if you didn't see it, or even just an acceleration event that didn't involve the head, you might want to have them go see a doctor or consider pulling them off. Definitely pull them out of the game if they're confused or have blurry vision. But this is, this should be, you should identify it with them, or if they're a kid, with their parent. And, hopefully there's, you have some policy if you're a coach for dealing with this. So yeah, quick aside. When I was a teenager, I forgot about this. I used to do karate because it was the 90s and nobody did MMA because it wasn't a thing. And we were sparring without headgear because all the memes you see about the 80s and early 90s being like anti-safety are true. And I got kicked in the side of the head, went fully unconscious on the floor. And I just remember them picking me up off the floor and asking if I was okay. And I went to say something like, I got hit in the head, which they all knew. But the words all came out in the wrong order. And I couldn't speak for maybe like 5 minutes without the words coming out in the wrong order.
Oh, you had aphasia.
Yeah, no, I had like full out aphasia for a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Like I could form the words in my head, but when I went to speak them, it was just like this jumble of nonsense words. Of course, I didn't go to the doctor because, like 1994 or something.
I have a similar story, actually. A total non-contact sport as well. I was training for the Highland Games, and I lost the caber. So the caber is this giant log that you flip.
I remember this.
And the caber came back behind me, and when the top end of it hits, the bottom end that you're holding comes down really fast. Physics. And so that fast end managed to come down full speed. And what you're supposed to do when you lose a caber is you're supposed to drop it. But I was just learning how to do it. So I just kind of kept holding on to it and then let it go. And then as I turned around, the fast end came right onto my head. and it was like a cartoon. I kind of stumbled sideways a couple of steps, like it was one of those Looney Tunes cartoons. Spit out some parts of teeth and fell over. And then the next thing that happened was I remember just opening my eyes and everybody's around me, and the first person looks at me and says, "We thought you were dead." And so
Yeah, me
yeah,
too.
and this is after I already had maybe like 1,000 concussions in football. So, and mind you, one thing that we didn't really touch on that much, but there was this idea of cumulative effects of concussions and how they get worse,
Yeah.
and that was something that Dr. Johnson, who was the neurologist that I saw at McGill, had mentioned to me, that they get progressively worse each time. I also didn't see a doctor,
Yeah, I
by the way,
believe that's
after that. Yeah.
oh, good. Perfect. So do what we say, not what we do.
hmm
And I mean, you got a PhD, so clearly everything's
Oh,
fine.
totally. Yeah. The random headaches that I get
your
after
brain
just
is
like
okay.
lightly bumping my head that ruin my day are totally normal.
For
Yeah.
sure. So other things that we can, that can be done. I think we mentioned rule changes, like not letting youth head the ball in soccer. Similarly, equipment improvements have made some, positive effects, or had positive effects. Improved helmet design, harnesses in motorsports, stuff like that. But there's one thing I sort of want to go out on, and that's youth. So one thing I can't get my head around is, combat sports where they're sparring for youth. This is just, I can't see any justification for it. Like, given what we know about, the potential effects of subconcussive blows to the head, like even, it calls into question the effectiveness of headgear. I know kids aren't hitting each other hard and they probably aren't giving each other concussions, but there's also, it's just too hard to justify. I can't get behind it. Like, if you're, an informed adult or even a teen who wants to play something like football, know the risks, know how to identify signs and symptoms of concussion, and, do your best to, engage in the safest way that you can. Kids in sports where the goal is to strike each other in the head, I don't know. Yeah, I rethink it. I don't, I'm going to get hate mail for this, but just don't.
I mean, given that we know that
that's all
there's a cumulative effect, wouldn't you want them to start taking concussions later on when they're already more developed, so that they actually can go into adulthood?
Not at all,
yeah, or not at all, but sure.
Yeah,
but let's say you just want to be violent.
I mean, it's the
like it's
yeah, I mean, it's the opposite of giving them a head start.
Yeah,
right. It's the opposite of giving your kid a leg up in life. Like, let's start them from behind the start line. It just, I don't know. I can't get behind it.
I'm with you.
Much. So I don't know. We probably lost some of our viewership there. All right, so let's take this across the finish line. Thanks everybody for listening. If you got this far, subscribe to the podcast. Turns out that really matters in terms of putting our podcast in front of new people. Like it, give us a positive rating. Even if you hated the podcast, especially that last bit where we gave you parenting advice. You can also watch us on YouTube at Praxis Strength and Nutrition. Links in the show notes. Links to our website in the show notes, practicepn.com. And you can follow us on Instagram, Praxis Strength and Nutrition. Again, links in the show notes. Get to it. Thanks for listening. Have a great night.
Take care.